founding of Berlin. Where the Petra Church once stood in Berlin, there once rose a temple on a sandy hill, dedicated to the three-headed god Triglav. This was a deity of the Slavs, who settled in what is now the German-speaking region, and were known as the Wends. Around the sanctuary stood a few humble fishermen's huts. It was a Wendish settlement called Köln. That was the beginning of the German capital. How old Berlin was founded next to the old Köln is told in the following folktale. Albert the Bear, the first Margrave of Brandenburg, had gotten lost while hunting in the marshlands of the River Spree. Separated from his hunting companions, he was preparing to spend the night in the forest when he saw a flickering light across the Spree. He followed the light and soon came upon a stilt house built over the water, accessible only by a narrow footbridge. He knocked at the wicker gate, and a servant let him in. The servant led him into a room lit by pine torches where the settlement's owner sat on a bearskin. He greeted him in the Wendish manner and asked what he desired. Albert replied that he had become separated from his companions and was seeking shelter for the night. However, he did not reveal that he was the Margrave of the land. The Wend replied, "Though you are a Christian, Rudolph of Strahlo knows to show hospitality even to such as you. Here are some fish. There on the fur you will find a place to rest." But Albert, who knew the customs of the Wends, requested salt and bread to eat together with the Wend. Only thus would he be recognized as a guest friend and ensure his safety. Rudolph of Strahlo gave both, though reluctantly, and so Albert was able to lie down in peace. But he could not sleep. There was much movement and activity in the house. Servants came and went until at last one informed Rudolph of Strahlo, "All is ready." Rudolph stood and prepared to leave. But Albert rose as well and asked, "Where are you going?" The Wend did not wish to tell him, until the Margrave reminded him that he was now his guest friend. So Rudolph finally agreed to reveal that he was going to a Triglav festival. Albert demanded, "Then take me with you." The Wend could not refuse his guest friend, but first he wrapped him in a Wendish fur coat. Then they boarded a boat that awaited them at the water's edge. Swiftly they traveled down the River Spree, and more boats joined them along the way. Where the Spree divided, they disembarked to climb up to the Triglav temple on a sandy height. A low murmur met them at the entrance. The temple was full of Wends. Albert looked around. In the background he noticed a large curtain behind which strange moaning could be heard. Then a procession of white-robed priests entered and began invoking the three-headed god. Their cries grew louder and more frenzied. When their wild calling reached its peak, the curtain was drawn back, and Albert saw a figure of their god woven from willow branches. The entire interior of Triglav was filled with captive Christians, who were now to be offered as burnt sacrifices. The high priest approached the pile of wood beneath and set it alight. Albert was already drawing his sword to free his fellow believers. But Rudolph of Strahlo quickly pulled his guest friend into the dark night to save him from certain death. In silence they returned to the stilt house. But once they arrived, Albert spoke sharp words. "I will found a settlement here in the swamp and call it Barlin. It shall bring the Wends together in fear, so that no Christian need ever burn again." The Wend looked at his guest in astonishment. "You speak proud words full of lordly spirit. Who are you?" "Do you not know me? I am Albert, whom they call the Bear. My Barlin shall rule in the land of the Wends, and its paws shall stretch wide over swamp and sand, but Strahlo shall enjoy special protection because he gave me shelter." Thus, so the folktale says, beside the Wendish settlement of Köln arose the German Barlin, later Berlin, and for a long time the two towns existed side by side until they were united. The Adventures of the Kurrende-Boys. Long ago, in one of the boroughs of Berlin called Spandau, there lived the so-called Kurrende-Boys. They belonged to a church choir that performed in the Spandau church. One day they were given the task of cleaning the Spandau church, which they set about doing. While they were busy with this, they started playing cards with each other out of sheer high spirits. Suddenly someone approached them. It was the devil himself in human form, and he wanted to join their game. Quite calmly, they allowed him to play, without realizing who the man really was. But when the man began dropping card after card, the Kurrende-Boys soon realized that it was the devil, yet they kept playing anyway. One of them, who was losing particularly badly, even cried out that the devil should take him if he lost once more. And so he kept playing, and indeed he lost again. At that moment the devil leapt up and revealed his true form. He grabbed the Kurrende-Boy who had lost the game and tore him upward with him. Behind him, the church wall opened into a huge crack. A gate to hell had opened, and the devil disappeared into it with the boy. The crack in the wall can still be seen today and cannot be painted over. On another occasion, something strange is said to have happened as well, again because of the high spirits of the Kurrende-Boys. At that time, the church still had a room filled with large and heavy books which were chained down. Among them were said to have been the 6th and 7th books of Moses, which no longer exist today, but were said to contain all the old magical stories. When the remaining Kurrende-Boys were once again cleaning the church, they came upon these books. Curious, as boys tend to be, they opened the books to see what was inside. No sooner had they opened them and begun to read than the entire church was suddenly full of ghosts from top to bottom, awakened by the boys having touched the books of Moses. Of course, they were seized with terrible fear the moment they saw all the ghosts around them, and it was fortunate that the preacher arrived in the church just in time. He began to read the book backwards, and then the haunting vanished. The Enchanted Princess on the Muggelberg. Long ago, in a borough of Berlin called Köpenick, the inhabitants would tell strange stories about a peculiar stone on the Muggelberg, a wooded ridge also located in Köpenick. The locals said the stone had been shattered, and its pieces were used to build their wells. It was also called the Devil's Altar, and at the place where it had once lain, a fire would often blaze up, glowing so brightly that it could even be seen from Köpenick. But as soon as anyone approached and spoke a single loud word, the fire would vanish again. Other inhabitants, however, claimed that the stone, also known there as the Princess's Stone, still lay on a hillock near the so-called Devil's Lake in Köpenick, which is surrounded by dense forest. The water of this lake is nearly black, and although it is quite small, no one has yet succeeded in fathoming its depth. The stone is said to stand at the site where once a magnificent castle stood, in which a beautiful princess lived, who was now enchanted and had sunk into the mountain along with the castle. Yet from time to time she still reappears. Beneath the stone there is an opening, and from there a path leads deep into the mountain. From this opening people have seen her emerge in the evenings, hunched over and leaning on a staff in the guise of an old woman. Others have also seen her, around midday, as a stunningly beautiful young woman sitting by the shore of the Devil's Lake, gazing at herself in the water, and combing her long hair with a large comb. Once, a little girl from Köpenick, who had been out picking berries with her mother near the lake and lost sight of her mother, saw the princess. The child wandered through the forest crying, until the princess took her down into her castle and after a short while brought her back up again richly gifted. When one sees the princess emerge from the mountain in the evening, she carries a little box filled with shining gold. This treasure will go to whoever carries her 3 times around the church of Köpenick at night without looking back, thus freeing her from her curse. One young man once longed for the gold and dared to attempt it. He lifted the princess onto his back, for she was as light as a feather, and began walking with her to Köpenick. But the closer he came to the town, the heavier his burden grew. Yet he bravely pressed on and finally reached his goal. He arrived at the edge of the forest on the outskirts of Köpenick, at the church in question, and began to walk around it. Suddenly from the dark forest appeared countless snakes and toads and all manner of hideous creatures with glowing fiery eyes. Goblin-like beings were among them as well, and they pelted the young man with logs and stones, but he let none of these horrors deter him and strode forward courageously. He had already begun the 3rd circuit, and had almost completed his task when a glaring red light blinded him. So terrifying it seemed as if all of Köpenick were in flames. Then he forgot the prohibition and looked around. But in that very instant everything vanished, and a violent blow to his head from an invisible force took his life. Some time later, another man tried to claim the gold and free the princess. He was a fisherman from Köpenick named Buck. He often saw, when he cast his nets on the Lake Muggelsee of Berlin at midday, a wagon drawn by 4 horses coming down from the Muggelberg. On the wagon sat a white, ghostly figure, and all 4 horses pulling the wagon had no heads. After he had seen this apparition several times, and once again one day, he thought he heard a voice calling to him, telling him to come at midnight to the churchyard in Köpenick and wait there. The princess would appear, and if he carried her 3 times around the church without looking back, she would be freed and he would receive the great treasure that lay under the stone. So he went there at night and began his march with the princess on his back. Again the dreadful creatures with their glowing fiery eyes appeared, but he kept calm and walked on. But then, just as he was about to complete the 3rd circuit, a large hay wagon appeared out of the dark forest, heavily loaded and drawn by 4 tiny mice. This strange sight confused the fisherman so much that as the wagon passed, he instinctively followed it with his eyes, and finally turned to look completely around. In that moment he received a pair of heavy slaps, and both the princess and the wagon with the mice disappeared. Some people say he didn't actually see any further apparitions, but rather that his wife, who had long been jealous of him, had followed him, slapped him for his unfaithfulness, and scolded him thoroughly. But the princess still waits for the man who will someday break her curse, yet for a very long time now no one has seen the princess again. The departure of the Rodensteiner. In the low mountain range of the Odenwald, in the south of the state of Hesse, stand two castle ruins. The ruins of the Rodenstein castle and the ruins of the Schnellert castle. The Rodenstein castle was once the seat of a powerful family of knights. One of the lords of Rodenstein was a passionate warrior and hunter. However, at a tournament in the city of Heidelberg, he fell in love and married a beautiful woman. But the peaceful life did not hold him for long. A feud with a neighbor called him back to the bloody craft of war. Despite the desperate pleas of his pregnant wife to stay with her, he went off to battle. The emotional shock to his wife led to a premature birth. The child was stillborn, and she herself also died. The knight went to the Schnellert castle, where he was closer to the enemy. There, the spirit of his deceased wife appeared to him, and pronounced a curse. Because he had chosen war over love, he would have to wander the land as an ominous harbinger of war until the day of judgment. Soon after, the Rodensteiner fell in battle and was buried at the Schnellert castle. But his spirit found no rest. Whenever a war threatens, he rides, accompanied by a ghostly host, noisily through the region, heralding doom with the clatter of hooves, hunting cries, horns, and trumpets. His path leads him from the Schnellert castle to the Rodenstein castle. There he lingers until peace returns, then he rides back through the air more quietly, back to the Schnellert castle. The fire-breathing cats of Rodenstein castle. In the Odenwald in the south of the state of Hesse, many families were once dirt poor, and even went hungry. They dreamed of a shower of star coins, and of owning a donkey that could spit gold. And those who lived near Rodenstein castle wondered where the fine ladies and gentlemen of Rodenstein might have buried their treasures. One day, a farmer's wife, who was well versed in all sorts of secret matters, said to her husband, "Our children and we are starving and will die if a miracle doesn't happen. Go to Rodenstein castle, they say, not far from the mill tower. A great treasure is buried. Perhaps we can avert our misfortune with it. But you must know, the treasure can only be unearthed at midnight. Great and dangerous cats guard it. They say that no treasure seeker has ever reached it, and none has ever returned unharmed. But you are clever and brave. You can, no, you must succeed." So the farmer, an honest and strong man, equipped himself with all sorts of tools and set off toward the ruins of Rodenstein castle. On the way he met an old white-haired little man. The man said to him, "You have worked hard all your life and cared lovingly for your wife and your 4 children even in hard times. Take this little pipe. If you blow into it, it will help you 3 times in need or danger, but use it sparingly, and only when you truly must." And with that the little man vanished. Gray veils of mist lay over the castle ruins as the farmer arrived at the east gate at the stroke of midnight. The full moon bathed the ruins in a mysterious light. Suddenly, a large cat appeared, hissed at the farmer, and extended its sharp claws. Fire and flames shot from its mouth and nose. The farmer raised his mattock to fend off the cat, but then thought, "Why should I waste my strength fighting the cat when I still need it to dig up the treasure? Let me see if the little pipe can take care of this for me." He blew into it, and at once, as if guided by a ghostly hand, a strong dog appeared, with eyes as big as coffee cups. It growled and barked and chased the cat into the forest. When the cat was gone from sight, the dog disappeared as well. The farmer now reached the large gate to the castle courtyard. Suddenly he felt his whole body grow scorching hot, for a second fire-breathing cat, with claws as long as kitchen knives and even bigger and more terrifying than the first, confronted him and spat fire in his direction. The farmer barely managed to dodge it, hid behind a tree, and thought, "This monster is strong and dangerous. Perhaps I should thrust my spade into its throat, but why risk my life?" So he blew the magic pipe again. This time, from the ghostly wall of mist emerged a gigantic dog with eyes as big as wagon wheels. It dragged the cat into the bushes with its sharp teeth, and both of them vanished. When the farmer reached the mill tower, he thought his final hour had come. For a third fire-breathing cat leapt at him. It was bigger than a tiger and had claws as big and long as butcher's knives. It spat a huge torrent of fire in the farmer's direction. He was on the verge of burning alive, but managed in his greatest distress to grab the pipe one more time. From the swirling fog of the spirit world, a shaggy dog emerged, even taller than the mill tower. Its eyes were almost as big as mill wheels. It fought the monstrous cat and managed to defeat it, and again both vanished. The farmer barely managed to extinguish the flames on his body in time, and could at last search for the treasure unhindered. With a divining rod carved from a forked hazel branch, he found the spot where the treasure lay. He dug with his spade as fast as he could. He broke into a vault and discovered an ornately decorated yet lead-heavy chest, surely filled with gold and silver, fine jewelry, pearls, rings, and goblets, everything the gentry of old would have owned. But despite all his tools' strength and skill, he could not manage to open the chest, nor could he move it or drag it outside. In his desperation he pulled out the pipe again and blew into it. This time, however, no dog appeared, but the little white-haired man, who said, "The spirits have helped you 3 times, now no one will help you anymore." And with that, the little man disappeared once more. At that very moment the vault collapsed and buried the treasure under it again. In the end, the farmer had to be glad that he escaped with his life. And the treasure, they say it still lies hidden at Rodenstein Castle, waiting to be claimed by an especially brave treasure-seeker. The Serpent of Rodenstein Castle. Long ago, in the Odenwald in the south of the state of Hesse, a mother was walking with her daughter Hannah near the ruins of Rodenstein Castle, gathering firewood in the forest. There they met an old man with white hair and a walking stick, who wandered about with weary and sorrowful eyes. "Why do you look so sad?" asked Hannah's mother. The old man replied, "I miss my beloved son. For almost 100 years I have wept for him every day. That's how old I am. He was taken from me by the guardian of the castle ruins, because he thought we were stealing stones from the ruins and perhaps even trying to dig up the castle's treasure. He didn't believe that we were only gathering wood. As punishment for what he thought was a lie, he turned my son into a serpent, but he had spoken the truth." The old man sounded utterly desperate, and now he can only be freed by a girl who has never told a lie and has never stolen anything. Could your daughter perhaps help me? The girl looked at her mother. "I think I've never lied, and I've certainly never stolen," she said, and she found the task rather exciting. But her mother was uneasy about the situation and asked the old man, "What is my daughter supposed to do?" And he replied, "Come to the Rodenstein ruins tomorrow, 1 hour before midnight. If she has truly always been honest, the ruins will rise again as a castle before your eyes, and you can enter. In a room in the cellar you will find a chest, whose key is guarded by a serpent. That is my enchanted son. If your daughter is not afraid and shows the serpent she wants to help, it will surely give her the key. That is the sign. Then the serpent can turn back into a human. The contents of the chest may make you rich, but beware, you must be quick, because at exactly midnight the castle will collapse back into ruins. Make sure you are not crushed by the falling stones." The mother was, of course, worried and hesitant, but Hannah was thrilled by the adventure. "Mother, it would be wonderful if we could save the boy. Let's try." Eventually, the mother let herself be persuaded. The next night they went to the castle ruins as they had been told. Barely had they arrived when they heard a loud rumbling and crashing. The walls grew, sprouted windows and doors, and finally there it stood, Rodenstein Castle. Hannah was very excited, grabbed her mother's hand and pulled her toward a large wooden door. They entered the castle and walked through a corridor lined with shining suits of armor and weapons on the walls. Then they came to a hall, around whose table the Rodenstein knights and their ladies sat at a delicious-smelling feast. Hannah and her mother moved on and found a door behind which a staircase led down to an underground passage. They followed it to a great iron door that was hard to open and creaked terribly. At last they entered a vaulted cellar, in the center of which stood a large chest. Coiled around a golden key on top of it lay a great serpent. It raised its head, hissed, and flicked its forked tongue. It looked uncanny and very frightening. The serpent fixed its unblinking yellow eyes on Hannah. She was surprised. "Could this be the enchanted boy?" she asked her mother. "I don't know. Be careful," her mother replied. As Hannah, a little nervously, stepped closer to the chest, the serpent snatched up the key in its mouth and reared up. Then it stared at Hannah's face again. But she thought she saw a friendly glimmer in its eyes, and suddenly she was no longer afraid. She stepped closer and took the serpent in her arms. Immediately it coiled itself around Hannah's neck and body. The mother was terribly frightened, rushed forward and tried to free Hannah from the creature at once, but Hannah gave her a sign. She was still unafraid and said calmly to the serpent, "Don't be afraid, I want to help you become human again," and she gently stroked its head. Suddenly the serpent's body began to twitch and tremble, and the twitching grew stronger and stronger. From its body grew arms, then a head, a torso, and legs, and all at once a boy stood before Hannah, looking at her gratefully. At that same moment, however, a bell began to ring. The walls cracked and rumbled. "It's midnight, hurry," said the boy. "Let's open the chest and go." He took the key and unlocked the chest. Inside lay countless magnificent things: golden goblets, bracelets, rings, and many other treasures. But the crashing grew louder and the ceiling was already splitting. They barely had time to grab a few things, took each other by the hand and ran with Hannah's mother to another door in the room, and burst through it into the open air. Moments later, the walls and towers were already swaying, and with a loud crash, the entire castle collapsed into itself. The Spinner in the Moon. Long ago, in a small village in Saxony-Anhalt, there lived a poor old widow with her only daughter named Marie. The mother was sick and weak and could no longer work, but that did not matter much, for Marie was the best spinner far and wide. She could spin 3 skeins of yarn each day, and her thread was the finest. In this way she supported herself and her old mother. Unfortunately, she had one great flaw. She was wild and careless, and she had to be at every festivity and every dance. This caused her pious mother much sorrow, and though she reproached and admonished her enough, it was all in vain. Especially in autumn and winter, the girl's desire awoke when the young women of the village gathered to spin, and the young lads joined them. Then there was playing, shouting, singing, and dancing, and instead of going home at a decent hour, it all went on late into the night. The wildest of them all, and the last to return home, was Marie. Her mother bore it patiently for a long time, since her warnings did no good anyway. But one day, on the Feast of Mary, when Marie was about to go out again, she said to her daughter, "I feel especially sick and weak today, and don't want to be alone for so long. Please, just for today, promise me you will come home before midnight and not linger in the streets. You are my only daughter, the last person I have left. I have no one else, so lonely am I. And because I am so old and frail, I feel afraid and sad when no one is here with me. That's why I beg you, my dear child, come back to me in time, and don't forget. Today is the Feast of Mary, and if children disobey their parents today, they are punished on the spot." The mother's words struck Marie's heart so deeply that she wept, and she promised her mother she would certainly not play or dance and would be home before midnight, as true as the moon stood in the sky. With this promise she took her spinning wheel and left. But she had hardly been spinning for an hour when singing and music rose loudly outside, and the young lads of the village arrived. They had brought musicians, the spinning wheels were pushed aside, and everyone began to dance and sing. Marie at first didn't want to join in the dancing, but the music, her love of dancing, and the young men's pleas went deeper into her heart than the promise she had made her mother, and so she broke her promise. It was long past midnight when at last they were about to part, but the music accompanied them into the street, and as they passed by the churchyard and found its gate open, the lads seized the young women and pulled them into the churchyard, where the dancing began anew. Marie had completely forgotten her promise and danced merrily in the bright moonlight. Meanwhile her mother sat anxiously in her room, waiting in anguish for her daughter. Then she suddenly heard the shouting and noise from the churchyard. She could no longer contain herself. She left the house and followed the noise. Thus she came to the churchyard, where she saw her daughter in the midst of the dancers. This sight broke the mother's heart. She began to weep and cried out to her daughter through her tears to come home with her at once. But the girl replied, "Oh, mother, don't cry. The moon is still shining so bright and beautiful in the sky. You go ahead, I'll come soon." That was the last straw. The old woman looked up at the moon and cursed her daughter. "I wish," she said, "that this wayward child might sit in the moon and have to spin there forever." She had hardly spoken the words when Marie vanished from among the dancers, and one saw her, with her spinning wheel in her hand, flying swiftly like a lightning bolt toward the moon. She still sits there today spinning, and when the moon shines bright and full, one can clearly see her spinning up there. She spins fine and delicate threads which fall down to the earth in autumn. The wind scatters and tears them, and they drift onto hedges and trees. People call them summer silk or Mary's threads. The Shepherd York. Long ago, near the village of Elsenfeld, in the low mountain range of the Spessart in Bavaria, there once lived a shepherd called Shepherd York, and his wife, whose name was Eva. The two were regarded throughout the area as righteous people. When Shepherd York tended the sheep in the fields, he would play religious and other songs on his flute so movingly and beautifully that it touched the hearts of passers-by. At that time, however, many robberies and murders took place in the region, and no matter how much people searched for the culprits, they could not be found. There was not even a trace of them. People were attacked and killed on the roads, and these crimes became so frequent that no one dared enter the woods at night anymore. Not only lone travelers were robbed and slain, but even 2 or more people walking together were killed. In the morning, their bodies were found lying dead in the forest. People assumed that an entire band of robbers was at work. No one suspected Shepherd York and his wife, who outwardly seemed so pious and respectable. No soul would have thought of them in the slightest, and yet they were the perpetrators. Why they were never caught, it was because they used black magic in their crimes. Whenever a child was born to them, they would kill it and cut off its little finger, dry it, and when they wanted to commit a robbery or murder, they would light the finger like a candle. The person holding the burning finger would gradually dissolve until invisible. Only when the finger burned out did they become visible again. So when people walked through the pine forest at night, they saw nothing but a light by the path. If they curiously approached the light, thinking nothing evil of it, Shepherd York would strike them on the head with his hatchet, and they never knew where the blow came from. Once, long before Shepherd York became a murderer, 3 young men from Elsenfeld set out in the spring on the 2nd day of Easter to travel abroad. One was a tailor, the second a blacksmith, and the third, named Caspar, was the only son of a miller, and had learned to become a miller himself. Together they stopped at an inn called the Crown to have a farewell drink because they had always been such good comrades. There they agreed to stay away for 7 years, but if they were still alive after that time, they would meet again at the same inn on the 2nd day of Easter and return home together, just as they had left. After their time at the inn, they walked together for a while until their paths finally parted. They were lucky and found good masters to work for and earned a nice sum of money. 7 years passed, and the 3 began their journey home, meeting again at the Crown on Easter Monday just as they had arranged. The miller arrived first, then the blacksmith, and finally the tailor. They were overjoyed to see each other safe and sound, shared stories of their adventures, and drank to their future success until it grew dark outside. Then they set off for home. In recent days, however, the weather had thawed, and the river Elsava had overflowed its banks, flooding the entire valley and becoming a raging torrent. As they came closer to the place where the great walnut tree stood, they heard Shepherd York playing his flute and said, "That's Shepherd York, we're almost home." Suddenly the playing stopped and a light appeared. They saw the light but no one carrying it. It floated straight up in the air in front of them. Shepherd York had heard the travelers coming, hidden behind the walnut tree, and lay in wait for them. But the wild river rushed up under the tree, and the 3 comrades hesitated, wondering whether to go forward or turn back. Suddenly a voice called out, "Put down your packs and your clothes or you'll all die." At the same time, he struck the leading tailor on the head so hard he staggered. The 3 didn't know what was happening and begged him to take their packs but spare their lives. Shepherd York replied again, "Lay your packs and all your clothes on the ground, and when you've undressed, climb up the walnut tree and don't make a sound, or you're done for." So they stripped off their packs and clothes and had to climb the walnut tree naked. Once they were up there, they pleaded again that he shall take their belongings and then simply go away. But Shepherd York had no such intention. His lust for murder was too strong. Instead, he extinguished the flame of the burning finger he had lit and became visible again. And because the moon came out from behind a cloud just then, the 3 young men recognized him and cried, "You are the Shepherd York." Shepherd York took his rifle in his hands, stepped under the tree, and said, "Well, now your last hour has come." When they heard that, they started begging for their lives again, promising never to reveal him and asking him to think of the great misery he would cause if he killed them. But Shepherd York just laughed and asked who would really suffer such great sorrow. Then the tailor said, "My master has always loved me, for no one has worked to his satisfaction as I have. I told him I'd come back, and he won't know what to do if I don't return." "That's not true," said Shepherd York. "Just this morning he hired a new journeyman," and with these words he shot him from the tree. But the tailor didn't die instantly. He fell into the water with a scream, splashed and gurgled about, thrashing wildly, and Shepherd York laughed loudly. Then he was swept down the river and drowned. The blacksmith said, "My beloved Eva and I have known each other for 10 years, and now we're to be married. Look, In my pack is the wreath she is to wear on our wedding day. Today she's waiting for me, and she'll never have a happy hour again if I don't come home." "What a coincidence," laughed Shepherd York. "My wife is also called Eva. We've been married for many years." And with that he shot the blacksmith dead from the tree as well, and he too drifted down the river. The remaining miller, Caspar, said, "Shepherd York, if you kill me too, you'll never have a moment's peace for the rest of your life. And remember, my mother has prayed every morning and evening for 7 years that I might come home to her again. Today she turns 75 and she's waiting for me." "That's not true," said Shepherd York. "Your mother has grown old and confused these last years, and doesn't even remember she has a son anymore. She's been lying in bed for a long time." Then he shot Caspar down from the tree as well. But he hadn't hit him fatally, and as the river carried him away he kept shouting, "Shepherd York, Shepherd York." Shepherd York feared he might yet reach the shore and ran down the riverbank to finish him off. He came to the mill where Caspar's mother lived, and seeing a light inside, peeked through the window. There sat Caspar's mother, the old miller's wife, still in her chair praying. The table was covered in white linen, with 2 plates and a bottle of wine with glasses set out. Just then, Caspar cried out one more time from far down the river, "Shepherd York, Shepherd York." The old woman raised her head and listened. But at that very moment, Caspar was swept into the river Main, into which the Elsava flows. The current pulled him under, and he also drowned. But Caspar's words became true. Shepherd York never had another peaceful moment. Wherever he went, he heard the rushing of water and the cries, "Shepherd York, Shepherd York." Sometimes he heard the 3 travelers calling together, sometimes just Caspar alone, and sometimes even Caspar's old mother. At last, unable to bear it any longer, he and his wife turned themselves in to the authorities and confessed everything they had done. They were sentenced to be torn apart alive by 4 horses. Shepherd York's wife Eva died repentant, but Shepherd York himself remained obstinate and unrepentant to the end. Even as he stood on the place of execution, he began to laugh. When asked why he was laughing, he said he saw the walnut tree over there, from which he had shot the 3 young men, and he remembered how funny it had been when the tailor splashed and gurgled in the water. "That was so amusing to watch," he said, "that I still have to laugh about it now." After the execution of Shepherd York and his wife, their bodies were burned, and their ashes were scattered into the river Main. The Burning Man of Hettingen. Long ago, in a small village called Hettingen, in the low mountain range of the Odenwald in Baden-Württemberg, a farmhand wanted to fetch a load of wood from the forest after a long rainy spring. Since the paths were soft and muddy, he drove his ox-drawn cart into a ditch and got stuck. No matter how hard he tried, cursing all the while, he couldn't get the wheels out of the mud. The wagon was simply too heavy. He had no choice but to unload half of the wood to make it lighter. The hard work took so long that it soon grew dark. Since he could no longer see anything, he had to stop working with a heavy heart. Just as he was about to unhitch the draft animals and head home, he was so startled that his heart nearly stopped. For from the direction of Hettingen, a brightly shining, burning skeleton came toward him, and pointed with its finger at the wood lying by the roadside. Then the farmhand hastily, with a pounding heart, loaded the wood back onto the cart, and after that, pulling the cart out of the mud seemed almost effortless to him. When the work was done, he looked around for the burning skeleton and said, "May the Lord reward you for this." To which the figure replied in a rough, crackling voice, "Your wish brings me salvation." No sooner had these words faded than the fiery figure dissolved into smoke and vanished forever. The Strong Hermel. Long ago, great heathen armies came to the river Rhine, seized the land along its banks, and claimed it as their own. Thus they also came into the Bergisches land, which today is part of North Rhine-Westphalia, and because they were more heavily armed, they forced the inhabitants to serve them. One man in particular, who was made to serve them, they eventually wanted to kill, first by their own hand, and then with the help of the hosts of hell, the devil himself and his demons. The story of these events, and how they ended, is told as follows. In the low mountain range of the Bergisches land lived a young fellow whom everyone called the Strong Hermel. He was very tall, broad-shouldered, extremely muscular, and possessed of immense strength. Yet he was so good-natured that he wouldn't harm a fly. His patience was so great that he was hardly ever provoked to anger, and in his simplicity he did whatever his masters commanded him. When he was 20 years old, he was made to serve the foreign heathens. They were delighted with the strong lad, and thought he could do many a fine job for them. So the Strong Hermel did as they wished, much to their satisfaction. But one day, when he was loading a wagon with straw, so full that the oxen could no longer pull it, the heathens began casting angry glances at one another. But Hermel paid them no mind. Instead, he simply tossed the oxen up onto the wagon and pulled it himself. That was too much for the heathens. They said, "The strong Hermel could one day become dangerous to us with all his strength. It is time we get rid of him." So they conferred on how best to remove him and came up with an idea. They went to Hermel and said, "Come down into the courtyard, Hermel. There you shall clean a well." So Hermel climbed into the well and began filling a bucket with mud, which was then hoisted up. Meanwhile the heathens treacherously rolled a number of large stones to the edge of the well, and suddenly hurled them down to crush Hermel. But he only sang a cheerful song at his work and was not at all disturbed by the falling stones. Only when the stones grew ever larger did he call up, "Shoo those hens off the edge of the well up there. They're scratching so many pebbles and dust into my eyes that I can't work properly." Next the heathens rolled a huge millstone to the edge and threw it down into the well. "Now he'll mock us no longer," the cowardly men exulted. But then Hermel laughed heartily from below and called up, "1,000 thanks, dear masters, for the fine collar you've thrown down to me." They looked down in astonishment, and behold, Hermel continued working calmly, wearing the millstone around his neck. Then the heathens decided to try one last thing. They harnessed 8 horses to a heavy wagon and dragged over an enormous church bell, which they threw into the well, thinking, "Now he is surely dead." Hermel stopped singing for a moment, but then called up, "1,000 thanks, dear masters, for the fine cap you've thrown down to me." Again they looked down and saw Hermel wearing the bell on his head and peeking out merrily from beneath it. But having finished his work he climbed out of the well and said, "I bear you no grudge for your little joke, but you must let me keep these fine things you've thrown down to me as gifts." The heathens conferred again and sent Hermel to the devil's mill to grind a great deal of grain there. But the devil's mill was an old cursed building that no one dared to enter any more, for a demon haunted it and killed anyone who dared show himself there. Hermel simply slung a few sacks of grain over his shoulder and went to the mill. He wasn't afraid, for he had never even heard of devils or demons. At the mill he poured out his grain and set the millstones in motion. But as soon as he began, the demon appeared and attacked him. Without much effort Hermel grabbed the demon and placed him on the millstone. The demon shrieked miserably as fire sparked from his bones, begging to be released. But Hermel held him there until his entire left leg was worn away. Only then did he let the demon go. Then Hermel filled the sacks with flour and cheerfully returned to his masters. They were astonished to see him return unharmed, and even more amazed when they heard how he had subdued the demon. At daybreak the heathens called Hermel again and said to him, "Hermel, you're making us poor men by staying here. So go down to hell to the devil and tell him to give you a sack of gold as big and heavy as you can carry. Bring it back to us and then you shall have good days." So they led Hermel to a mountain with a cave said to lead to the gates of hell. Hermel went inside, and when he disappeared the heathens rejoiced, "At last we've gotten rid of him. Surely he is finished now." After a long trek through the cave, Hermel came to an iron gate. He knocked and rattled it in vain for a long time, until finally he gave it such a mighty kick that it broke apart with a crash. Now he looked down into a great hall lit by countless fires, around which strange creatures moved that he had never seen before. He descended the great staircase, brushing away the giant bats that fluttered about his head. Then came the demon whose left leg he had worn away the day before. Seeing Hermel, the demon clutched his one remaining leg in terror, and hopped away howling as fast as he could. Hermel was brought before the devil himself, who sat on a fiery throne and asked who he was and what he wanted. Hermel explained that his masters could no longer feed him on earth and had therefore sent him to hell to fetch a sack of gold. The devil smiled and said, "You're a fine fellow. I'll propose 3 tasks. We shall compete at them. If you can match me, you may take the gold. But if you fail, your soul is mine and you shall remain here forever." "Agreed, Lord Devil," said Hermel. So the devil fetched a great hunting horn and said, "Let's see who can blow the strongest blast." The devil blew first, so powerfully that the mountain shook and 6 of the hellish fires went out. But when the strong Hermel blew the horn, it burst with a bang, and a piece struck the devil's head so that his horns wobbled. Around them 100 hellish fires were extinguished, and the 2 of them stood nearly in darkness. Then the devil took a great stone and threw it so high it almost touched the ceiling. Now it was Hermel's turn. He weighed the stone in his hand for a long time and then said, "Before I throw it, I'd better go outside into the forest and fetch a few oak trees, the strongest I can find." "Why's that?" asked the devil. "To prop up the ceiling," replied Hermel, "so it doesn't collapse when I throw the stone against it." At this the devil became fearful. and unwilling to be defeated again, slipped away on some pretext. Hermel simply filled his sack with gold and returned to his masters, who could hardly believe their eyes when they saw him. They rejoiced over the treasure but had no intention of keeping their word to Hermel. Instead, they began plotting anew how to get rid of the sturdy fellow. One day they sent him into the forest to fell wood. After he had chopped down and stacked many trees, he lay down for his usual midday nap, surrounded by heaps of timber. Then the treacherous heathens crept up and set fire to the woodpiles in many places at once. Soon Hermel was encircled by a sea of flames. At first they heard him snoring, but then only the crackling of flames and wood. The cowardly men raised a cheer and danced around the fire, thinking that at last the strong Hermel was finished. But suddenly Hermel began coughing in the smoke and leapt over the burning woodpiles. Seeing the treacherous heathens, he grabbed a tree, tore it from the ground by its roots, and struck them down wherever he caught them. The slain he strung up like little birds on a long pole, and slung it over his shoulders. Only a few heathens escaped across the Rhine, and they were never seen again in the German lands. And thus, in the end, the strong Hermel became the liberator of his homeland. The Pied Piper of Hamelin. In the year 1284, a strange man appeared in the town of Hamelin in Lower Saxony. He wore a coat of many-colored bright cloth, which is why he was said to be called Bunting, and he presented himself as a Pied Piper, promising for a certain fee to rid the town of all mice and rats. The citizens came to an agreement with him and assured him of a set payment. The Pied Piper then pulled out a pipe and played upon it, and immediately the rats and mice came crawling out of all the houses and gathered around him. When he believed none were left behind, he went outside, and the whole swarm followed him. Thus he led them to the river Weser. There he hitched up his clothes and stepped into the water, upon which all the animals followed him, and after plunging in they all drowned. But once the citizens were freed from their plague, they regretted the promised payment and refused to give it to the man, making all kinds of excuses, so that he went away angry and embittered. On June 26th, on the day of Saints John and Paul, early in the morning at 7 o'clock, according to others, at noon, he appeared again, this time in the guise of a hunter, with a frightening face and wearing a red strange hat. He began to play his pipe in the streets. But now it was not rats and mice that came, but children, the boys and girls from the age of 4 and up, in great numbers, among them even the grown-up daughter of the mayor. The whole throng followed him, and he led them out to a mountain where he vanished with them. This was seen by a nursemaid who had followed at a distance with a child in her arms. She then turned back and brought the news to the town. The parents ran in crowds out through all the gates, searching for their children with heavy hearts. The mothers raised a pitiful wailing and weeping. From that hour messengers were sent out by land and water to every place, inquiring whether anyone had seen the children, or even just a few of them, but all in vain. In all, 130 children were lost. 2 of them, according to some, were delayed and came back, but one was blind and the other mute, so that the blind one could not show the place but could tell how they had followed the piper. The mute one could point to the place even though he could not speak. One little boy, wearing only his shirt, ran along but turned back to fetch his coat, and thus escaped the calamity, for when he returned, the others had already disappeared into the hollow of a hill. The street through which the children left the town was still, as late as the mid-18th century, and perhaps still today, called the Drumless, Soundless and Silent Street, because no dancing was allowed to take place there, nor any string music to be played. Indeed, when a bride was brought to the church with music, the musicians had to fall silent when crossing that street. The hill near Hamelin where the children disappeared is called Poppenberg, where 2 stones in the shape of a cross stand on the left and right. Some say the children were led into a cave and came out again in Transylvania. The citizens of Hamelin had the event recorded in their town book and used to count the years in their notices from the loss of their children. On the town hall stood the following lines. In the year 1284, after the birth of Christ, in Hamelin, 130 children born there were led away by a piper and lost beneath the hills. And at the new gate it says, 130 children the magician had led away from the town 272 years before this gate was built. In the year 1572, the mayor had the story depicted in the church windows with the necessary inscription, which has mostly become illegible. There is also a coin that was minted commemorating it. The Black Horse. Long ago, It was the year 1590 in the former German town of Königsberg in Neumark, a town which today belongs to Poland. A black horse with burning eyes appeared one night in the hour between 11 and 12. It ran up and down through all the streets of the town with a terrifying noise and leapt so violently that the houses shook and fire shot out from the stones. In the morning the inner gate of the town was found open, and the horse was lying in the space between it and the outer gate, but as soon as the gatekeeper approached it sprang to its feet and vanished. Perhaps this horse was the devil himself, for that same evening, around 10 o'clock, a fire broke out in one of the town's houses, which he may have fanned to bring a great conflagration upon the town. The Haunting Monk in the Ringelturm of Lenin. In the ruined part of the Lenin Monastery Church, in the town of the same name in Brandenburg, there stands an almost completely preserved tower, at the top of which a winding staircase leads. That is why it is called the Ringelturm, or Spiral Tower. It is an uncanny place, for one often hears loud thudding on the stairs, up and down, and in the half-collapsed Gothic hall below, something seems to rage eerily. Those who are brave enough can even see a mighty figure, with a black face, curly hair, and a white robe. But one should not come too close, or else it will pursue you until you flee from the old churchyard. Others recognize in this figure a monk, who holds a book of the Gospels in his folded hands and looks up to heaven with sparkling eyes, as if praying to God for the peace of the graves that once lay in this part of the church, but were destroyed several years ago. No one can look at this old man without being deeply moved. The Ghostly Reapers. Long ago, in the year 1559 near Berlin, a strange and eerie event took place. One day several ghostly men suddenly appeared in the fields. As the day went on, more of them appeared, even more frightening to behold, for they had no heads at all. These spectral figures swung their scythes with all their might, cutting at the oats so that it rustled loudly, yet the oats remained standing and uncut. When word of this spread, many curious people hurried out to see this wonder with their own eyes. But when they asked the men who they were, where they had come from, and what they were doing, they gave no answer, but kept cutting tirelessly at the oats. And when some of the onlookers tried to approach and seize them, the figures quickly slipped away, ran off, and yet even as they ran they continued to mow the oats. When the people finally returned to the city, and were asked who or what they believed these men to be, they replied that they surely must have been evil spirits. Thereupon Elector Joachim II of Brandenburg summoned the most respected preachers of the region to ask them what these apparitions might mean. They declared it to be a divine warning, heralding the coming of the plague. Martin Luther and the Devil. Long ago, in the year 1521, the entire Christian world was in an uproar. A simple monk from Wittenberg, named Martin Luther, had stood up against both Pope and Emperor. In his writings, he denounced the sale of indulgences and declared that only the Holy Scriptures should be the foundation of true faith. Emperor Charles V summoned Luther to appear before the Diet in the city of Worms to renounce his teachings. Boldly, Luther stood before the emperor and the princes and declared, "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, Amen." With these words he steadfastly refused to recant his writings. In doing so, he made powerful enemies, and his life was in danger, for both emperor and pope declared him an outlaw. But Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony and Luther's protector, sought to shield him from his foes. On Luther's return journey from Worms, Frederick arranged for him to be secretly taken to the Wartburg Castle in Thuringia. There, Luther was to remain safely hidden for a time. And so Luther now sat behind the thick silent walls of the Wartburg, living under a false name, and devoted himself to a great task, translating the New Testament into German, so that the people might read the Bible for themselves. But his peace was not without disturbance. The devil, who feared the spreading of God's word, pursued him relentlessly. He sought to sow doubt, instill fear, and keep Luther from completing his holy work. One day, as Luther was deep in his sacred labor, he suddenly felt a dark presence around him. A demonic force filled the chamber, shadows flitted across the walls, and at last the devil himself appeared in his hideous infernal form. Luther cried out to him, "Away with you, Satan, you cannot frighten me," and in righteous fury he grabbed his inkwell, which by God's grace had been blessed with the power of the Holy Spirit, and hurled it at the devil's head. With a dreadful hiss, the devil vanished instantly, and the ink splattered against the wall, leaving behind a dark stain. To this day, visitors to the Wartburg are shown the very room and chair where Luther sat, and the spot on the wall where the ink is said to have struck is a silent witness to the battle between Martin Luther and the forces of evil. The Devil and the Dragon. Long ago, when the holy Bishop Narcissus came to the city of Augsburg in Bavaria, the devil appeared to him one day. He asked the bishop for a soul, in a body that could eat, drink, sleep, and remain awake. The holy man solemnly promised him one before God. The next day, the devil came before him again and said, "Holy bishop, remember your oath before your God. Give me a soul in a body I can kill, so I may take it." But Narcissus demanded an oath from the devil in return. He must swear to kill the one given to him immediately. If he broke this vow, he would be cast into the deepest pit of hell until Judgment Day. Then the devil said, "By him who once defeated me, I swear to kill him at once if you hand him over to me." Then the bishop said, "Go into the Alps, into the high mountains. There you will find a well from which neither man nor beast can drink, for a terrible dragon dwells there. Its poisonous breath kills all life that comes near it. Kill the dragon and take its soul." Then the devil roared with the voice of an angry lion, "You cunning, deceitful bishop, that dragon you speak of is a friend of mine. Because of my own oath, you are forcing me to kill my old friend. If I do not, I will be cast into the deepest pit of hell until the end of days." That very night, the devil reluctantly flew into the mountains of the Bavarian Alps. There, by the cursed well, he met the dragon, his companion from ancient days. A mighty battle erupted, so fierce that the rumbling could still be heard in Augsburg. The devil and the dragon hurled immense infernos at each other. The devil also cast lightning from his hands, but nothing could truly harm the dragon. Then the dragon lunged at the devil with its jaws wide open, intending to devour him and tear his dark soul to pieces. But at that very moment the devil summoned a flaming sword in his hand, and as the dragon struck, the devil plunged the sword straight into its heart. The dragon let out one final bone-chilling death cry and collapsed, dying. The devil also cried out, not a cry of triumph, but a scream of pain, of curse, and of hatred. He cursed God and the bishop, for they had tricked him into killing his old friend. Afterward, he vanished once more and returned to hell. From that time on, the well was freed from the dragon's curse, and it served the people for many years as a vital source of water. The Virgin and the Witch. Long ago, in the low mountain range of the Harz, in a valley called the Bodetal, there lived an old witch named Watelinde. She caused much mischief through her infernal arts and was greatly feared by all the inhabitants of the Harz region. She especially loved to lure pious virgins to her with all manner of enticing promises, so that she could cast her spells upon them and turn them into witches as well. One beautiful summer evening, a virgin named Hilda from the town of Thale went into the nearby forest to gather healing herbs. As night fell and her basket was nearly full, she prepared to head home. But after only 100 steps or so, moonlight broke through the treetops, and she remembered that herbs picked in moonlight were said to possess special healing powers. So she resumed her search with even greater eagerness, murmuring strange words under her breath as she picked. Suddenly 2 large, yellow, gleaming eyes shone out at her. Terrified, she tried to flee. After she had run some distance, she glanced nervously behind her and saw a large, black, cat-like creature leaping wildly through the bushes toward her. There was no escape. A hoarse voice called out to her, "Do not be afraid, Virgin. I mean you no harm. I only wish to tell you of the herbs with which you can bind your beloved to you forever." Hilda realized at once that this was the witch Watelinde in the form of a beast and tried to run. But suddenly the creature reared up in a threatening pose and cried out in a shrill voice, sparks flying from her form, "Yes, Virgin, you have now stepped into my circle of magic, and here I can do with you as I please." The cat transformed into an old woman. No sooner had the transformation completed than Watelinde seized the Virgin and tried to drag her up to the top of the rocky hill, where the witch's dance ground lay. In this moment of great fear, Hilda remembered her mother's teachings and made the sign of the cross. At once the air began to roar. A mighty storm wind howled around the summit of the witch's dance ground, swept down, and while lightning flashed and a great clap of thunder shook the surrounding cliffs, the wicked Watelinde was lifted into the air, swept across the valley, and hurled by an invisible hand against a rock, where she turned to stone. That rock is still known today as the witch's grandmother. Hilda, saved from ruin, returned safely to her mother's cottage, married her beloved, and lived a happy life. The Fate of 3 Miners. Long ago, in Czechia, in the region of Bohemia, there was a town called Kuttenberg, where many German miners and their families once lived. In the area, there was an important mine, and these miners had been brought in from the German lands to work there, for they already had long experience in mining. One day, 3 of these miners who had been working there for many years, and honestly earned their living to provide for their wives and children, once again set out for work. Whenever they entered the mine in the morning, they always took 3 things with them: their prayer book, an oil lamp with just enough oil for one day, and a piece of bread, also enough for only one day. Before starting their work, they would say a prayer and ask God to protect them in the mine. Then they would begin their labor with confidence and diligence. One evening, after working all day, the entrance to the mine suddenly collapsed and was completely buried. "Oh God, we must starve now, we have only one day's worth of bread and oil," they lamented. They commended themselves into God's hands and prepared for death, but they did not wish to let their time pass in idleness, so they continued to work and pray. Then a miracle happened. Their lamp burned for 7 years without going out, and the small piece of bread from which they ate daily remained the same size. To the men it felt as though only a single day had passed, yet in that time their hair and beards had grown to extraordinary lengths. Back home, the wives believed their husbands to be dead and even considered remarrying. One day, one of the miners, speaking from the depths of his heart and with tears in his eyes, said, "Oh, if I could just see daylight one more time, then I would gladly die." The second said, "Oh, if I could just sit at home at my wife's table and eat one more time, then I would gladly die." And the third wished, "Oh, if I could just live peacefully and happily with my wife for one more year, then I would gladly die." No sooner had they spoken these words than the mountain split apart with a great crash. The first miner looked up through a crack in the rock and saw the blue sky. Overcome with joy at the sight of daylight, he fell dead on the spot. The crack in the mountain widened, and the other 2 carved steps into the rock with their picks and climbed out. Arriving in the village, they went in search of their homes and wives, but the women did not recognize them. "Do you not have husbands?" the returned men asked. "Yes," the women replied, "but they have been dead and buried in the mine for 7 years." The second miner said to his wife, "I am your husband." But she did not believe him, for he looked completely different with his extraordinarily long beard. "Bring me the razor from the cupboard and a piece of soap," he asked. After shaving, washing, and combing his hair, she recognized him and rejoiced from the bottom of her heart. She prepared him a good meal, and they ate together cheerfully. But no sooner had the man eaten the last bite than he collapsed dead. His wife took him in her arms in shock and tried desperately to wake him, refusing to believe that her husband, who had been gone so long, was now truly dead. But it was so. When at last she realized this, she wrapped her arms tightly around his lifeless body and began to weep bitterly. The third miner lived another year in peace and harmony with his wife. But at the exact hour that he had emerged from the mine a year earlier, he too died, and his wife died alongside him. Thus God had granted the men their wishes as a reward for their piety. The Fire Mountain. A few hours from the town of Halberstadt in Saxony-Anhalt, in the low mountain range of the Harz, there rises an ancient mountain, now covered with dense dark fir trees and mighty oaks. But once it was barren and desolate, a grey ridge of rock without life, which the people of the region avoided. Many called it the Fire Mountain, for it was said that deep within its core the devil resided, and that underground fires burned there that never went out. Long ago in that region there lived a count whose name has long since been forgotten, but not his deeds. He was a harsh, domineering man who knew little compassion, and oppressed the people of the surrounding lands whenever he could. He forced excessive taxes from the villages, took the farmers' grain, their livestock, even their last coins, without the slightest pang of conscience. It was worst for the poor and defenseless. Even a shepherd who wandered the hills with his flocks was owed money by the count, but that debt was never repaid. Time and again the shepherd had come to the castle, politely but firmly reminding the count of his right. Each time the count had rejected him with scorn. "What do I care for the whining of a shepherd? Search for your coins in the grass if you've lost them." So time passed. Then one day news came. The count had vanished, likely dead in some far-off land. No one knew for sure. That evening the shepherd stood silently in his field and looked up at the Fire Mountain. "Justice," he murmured, "must come eventually." Later he went to the heirs of the count to claim what was owed him, but they roughly drove him from the castle. "Why should we care about your demands? Do you have proof that anything is owed to you?" They laughed. With a heavy heart the shepherd left once more. Some time later he was alone in the woods near the Fire Mountain. The forest was so still that even the snapping of a twig sounded loud. Suddenly the devil stepped from the undergrowth, tall and terrible to behold. "Do you want to see your old debtor?" he asked the shepherd. "Then follow me." Though the shepherd's heart pounded with fear, he followed the devil as if in a trance. The devil walked ahead without turning back, silent over leaf and stone. They came to the edge of the fire mountain. When they reached a certain spot, a deep rumble sounded, like distant thunder. The ground shook, and with a loud crash, the mountain opened before them. A fissure split the earth from which heat and fire poured forth. Without a word, the devil stepped inside, and the shepherd followed. Behind them, the mountain sealed itself shut. The mountain's interior was an immense cavern, filled entirely with fire. The air stank of sulfur, and a hot wind pressed on the chest, making it hard to breathe. Trembling, the shepherd stood still, and then he saw him. The count sat in the midst of the infernal chamber on a chair surrounded by the bursts of flame. He screamed loudly in pain, but when he saw the shepherd who had come to him, he cried out, "Do you want your money, shepherd? Then take this cloth, bring it to my descendants. Tell them you saw me, how I must sit in this fire in eternal torment, without end and without mercy." With trembling fingers he tore a cloth from his head and handed it to the shepherd. At that moment bright sparks burst from his eyes, and his voice broke into a hoarse whimper. The shepherd recoiled, his knees were weak, his breath short. The devil then silently led him back. The mountain opened once more, let the shepherd out, and closed behind him with a deep thunderous thud. The shepherd collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. He remained there for a long time before finally rising and returning to the castle with the cloth. Again he demanded his money. When they mocked him once more, he unfolded the cloth, and countless sparks sprang from the fabric, though there was no ember nearby. He told what he had seen. This time no one laughed. The heirs' faces turned pale. They remembered dreams, dark shadows in the night, things they had never dared to speak of. That very same day they paid the shepherd his money, and never again did any of them dare approach the fire mountain. The Witches' Dance on the Brocken. In the low mountain range of the Harz, in Saxony-Anhalt, there is a high mountain that rises above all others for nearly 50 miles around. It is called the Brocken. However, when people speak of the sorcery and witchcraft that occur on and around it, it is also referred to as the Blocksberg. At the summit of this mountain, which is strewn with countless boulders, the devil holds a splendid gathering each year with his demons and the witches. This takes place on the night from the last of April to the 1st of May, the so-called Walpurgis night. As soon as midnight has passed, the witches all come riding through the air from every direction. On oven forks, brooms, pitchforks, horned goats, and all kinds of other monstrous beasts, and the devil himself fetches some of them. Once all are assembled, they dance wildly around a roaring fire, shout for joy, swing burning torches through the air, and rage about until they are utterly exhausted. Seized by frenzy, the devil then steps onto the devil's pulpit, blasphemes against God, his teachings, and his dear angels. As host, he concludes the night with a feast at which nothing is served but sausages, prepared upon the witch's altar. The witch who arrives last must suffer a cruel death for her breach of customary etiquette. After receiving the final glowing embrace of the ruler of the underworld, she is torn to pieces, and her chopped-up flesh is cooked on the witch's altar and served as one of the main dishes, a grim warning to the others. With the first light of dawn, the entire vile rabble vanishes in all directions on the wind, so that these fiends may do no harm to people or livestock during their travels to and from the Brocken. The villagers living nearby mark 3 crosses on the doors of their homes and stables before Walpurgis night begins. They firmly believe that this protects themselves and their belongings from the witches and demons passing by.